I'm reading today from Deuteronomy 4:23 to 24 in the NIV. Be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden. For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God.
Good morning, everyone. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Michaela. This church is where I grew up. I spent a lot of my time here in youth, volunteering, all kinds of things. I now work at another MB church, McIver, all the way on the opposite side of the city. I work as the youth pastor there, so I'm really happy to be back here today and see a lot of people that I know and chat with different people, so that's been really nice. Now, here at Westwood, I heard that it's the season of weddings. There are a lot of couples that are getting married this summer, myself included. As Kevin and I, my fiance, as we prepare for marriage, I'm thinking more about the different aspects of marriage. And on the more difficult side, I know that there is the possibility for jealousy. And so I was thinking about it, and I asked myself, have I ever experienced jealousy in my relationship with Kevin? I can see him smiling right now. I think he knows where I'm going with this. And the more I thought about it, I realized that there's only one example that I can think of, and it's pretty silly. So a long time ago, I got a FaceTime call from Kevin, and when I pick it up, it is this cat. There's a kitten, I don't know. And so Kevin's family was given this kitten to take care of for a while, and he wanted to show me. So this cat, Luna, was very cute. She's this little gray kitten, crawling and jumping all over the place, typical adorable cat. And so throughout this FaceTime call, Kevin and I are sort of trying to have a conversation, but his attention would constantly go back to this kitten, which I can't really blame him, but still, it felt like he was paying more attention to Luna than to me. And when I thought about it later, I realized that there was maybe this little twinge of jealousy. And so it wasn't because I wanted to be the cat or I was jealous of her toys or anything. It really didn't have much to do with the cat, but rather the attention that I wasn't receiving from Kevin when we were trying to chat. So obviously that's kind of a silly example, and I told Kevin about it and we kind of laugh about it now. But the reason that I chose to talk about jealousy as a characteristic of God is because I actually knew very little about it. So when I usually think about the word jealousy, I don't really associate it with God. Most definitions will say that it is resentment or hostility towards someone because they have something that you don't, or because of their success or advantages. So I know this to be a pretty universal definition. But every once in a while, I will encounter verses in the Bible that state that God is a jealous God. And so it's kind of this constant struggle in how do I reconcile my definition of jealousy, which seems kind of sinful, and God's jealousy, the Creator who can't sin. And I've also heard people who are not Christians say, well, how do you follow this God who is all-loving, and yet he's jealous and willing to show his jealousy in destructive ways? It's a really tough question. And hopefully throughout this morning, I will convey my thoughts on this topic, and I might even argue that God's jealousy has a purpose, and it is necessary as a characteristic of his. So let's begin. As I just stated, there are many different definitions of what jealousy means. We cannot assume that the definition of God's jealousy is the same as human jealousy. If we look into the Bible, we can find early examples of sinful jealousy. In Genesis 30, verse 1, it says, "When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied or was jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, 'Give me children, or I shall die.'" Genesis 37, verse 11, it's about Joseph telling his brothers about his dream of them bowing down to him. And it says, "So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind." Now, the sinful jealousy in the second example here with Joseph's brothers, it led them to betray him and sell him as a slave. And even if we look at the New Testament, there are many examples of people giving over to their sinful jealousy. Some of these are religious leaders towards Jesus. In Acts 13, verse 44 and 45, it says, "The next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and blaspheming. They contradicted what was spoken by Paul." Now, these examples that I just gave, these are all sinful human jealousy. And I want to be really specific when I say sinful jealousy, because I believe that there are ways in which jealousy is not sinful, even for humans. When Paul speaks to the false prophets in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, "I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so I might present you as a pure virgin to him." This type of jealousy can actually be beneficial. It can encourage us on the right path. We can use this feeling to humbly help each other in our walks with Christ. And Paul's righteous jealousy, it stems from God. So we too must begin with God and the context for his jealousy. The passage I want to focus on today comes from Deuteronomy 4, as Liz read. God is commanding obedience from Israel. He has given decrees and laws to the people. He expects them to live in this way, to follow him. And these laws aren't coming from nowhere. It's not as though people had never met or experienced God before, and all of a sudden he appears and he demands that they follow him. That's not the case. God has consistently cared for these people. He has guided them, brought forth leaders in their communities. He has done extraordinary things for the people of Israel. In this passage, God is telling the people to follow the decrees, to observe them carefully. In doing so, the wisdom of God will be shown to the surrounding nations, so that they might say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." In chapter 4, God also warns the people of building and worshiping idols. He does not want them to be like the other nations, bowing down to a myriad of other things. Verses 23 and 24, as we read, say, "Be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden. For your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." Now, when we speak of jealousy, of God's jealousy, it never stems from him being needy, covetous, or wishing that he had someone else's things. Theologian J.I. Packer describes God's jealousy as his holiness reacting to evil in a way that is morally right and precious. It is a praiseworthy zeal on his part to preserve something supremely precious. When the people of Israel continually go against God, when they worship and serve things that are not God, he reveals his feelings of jealousy over the people. Now, sinful jealousy is when we desire something that does not belong to us. But in the case of God and Israel, the people have promised to obey God, to follow his commands. And so because they have turned away, they have decided to worship earthly idols, he has every right to be jealous. Only God is worthy of their praise and worship, and so his anger in this situation is warranted. God is jealous in the sense that he expects full devotion, not a partial commitment. Often the example of marriage is used regarding God's jealousy. The goal in marriage is to be fully committed to the person you are entering into agreement with. This isn't a half-in, half-out situation. If one spouse is not holding up their end, if maybe they're too focused on other people or things, or they're not putting effort into the marriage, it would make sense that the other person might be jealous. The promise they have committed to is not being made priority. And the people of Israel don't always do so well in this marriage, so to speak. They don't always honor their promise to God. And God, being infinitely holy and deserving of glory, he expresses his jealousy. Now, the reason for God's jealousy in this specific passage and in many Old Testament examples is that people are consistently turning to idolatry. Deuteronomy 4 clearly communicates what God does not want the people to do. Verses 15 to 20, you saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or woman, or like any animal on earth or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground or any fish in the waters below. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven. But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the iron-smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance, as you are now. So God here is not saying, I'm a jealous God, and I will and can act upon that jealousy if you mess up. But I'm also not going to tell you how to avoid my jealousy until you actually receive it. He's not saying that. God is actually providing for his people the ways in which they can best follow him. And yet they still choose idolatry in many of these occasions. But this being said, idolatry does not begin and end in the Old and New Testaments. The worship of things other than God continues in our world today. As Christ followers, there are often times that we too have to check ourselves. We must ask where the idols might be in our lives. What in my life is turning my attention from God? Am I too caught up in the latest electronic devices, in fashion trends, clothing, constantly needing these newer things to satisfy? Am I falling at the altar of my own pride, my own ego, trying to work more, striving solely for this worldly success, caring so much for what people think and letting it rule me? We can also ask ourselves if there is idolatry in the church. I've heard the saying, if we allow our work for the Lord to become more important than our fellowship with the Lord, we are guilty of ministry idolatry. So if our ultimate joy and satisfaction is coming from the work rather than Christ, we have to take a step back and think more deeply. Consider any idolatry that might be taking place. It is important to note that God's jealousy is not empty and without purpose. He has created each of us. His desire is to be in relationship with his people. He is jealous when our love and attention is far from him because, firstly, he is Lord. He deserves that worship, but also because he so deeply loves us. And for all of you who have decided to be a Christ follower and to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you have entered into this relationship with God. This relationship requires attention. It's not a 50-50 job. One gives half and the other gives half, 50-50. Just like in a marriage, both parties have to give 100%. And so because God is already giving 100% on his end, we must be willing to recognize the things on our side that get in the way of this relationship and work to rearrange those priorities. So this leads us into some practical steps. Like I was saying before, since we know that God is a jealous God, we must continually check our part in the relationship, checking where there might be idolatry in our lives. And when we notice these areas in our lives, actively turning from these things that provoke God's jealousy. When Kevin and I get married, and I'm sure I'll do something wrong, it's important that I recognize the issue, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot if my behavior and my actions continue on the same path. Knowing that God is a jealous God also means that we worship him. John 4, verse 24 says that God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. A couple weeks ago, I was having a chat with some of the young adults at our Bible study, and we talked about the worship team and how it can sometimes feel mechanical and maybe not always genuine. And we talked about how to change this and how we can balance having a good music practice, making sure that everything is good and they're on the same page, but also being intentional about worshiping and focusing on God. And a final way to bring action from God's jealousy is to commit to his cause. We can look to people in the Old Testament who commit to the Lord, even in a time where many were spiritually compromised. An example in Numbers 25, beginning at verse 10, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by manifesting such zeal among them on my behalf that in my jealousy I did not consume the Israelites. Therefore say, I hereby grant him my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of perpetual priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the Israelites." And if we go back to the New Testament, we also have Paul, who I mentioned near the very beginning. He communicates with the people that he is jealous for the people with a godly jealousy. So Paul's actions here stemmed from a righteous place, from the place of God's jealousy. We see God's cause, and Paul pursues it passionately. But I understand it can be really difficult to read the biblical text and understand God's jealousy. It can be really tough to look at our own lives and see the potential idolatry that we must work on. But in all of this, we can look back to Deuteronomy 4, which also gives encouragement and hope. Verse 7 and 8 say, "What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us whenever we pray to him? And what other nations so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you today?" So we can see that while God is a jealous God, he is also near to his people. He gives righteous laws that help guide them along and do not lead them into confusion. He wants the people to observe the laws so that they will stand out in the nations, so that they are considered wise and understanding. It also says that he is near when they would pray. The same principles apply for us today. Although we are not one specific nation, we as the church body have a great God who draws near. We have a God who gives us guidelines and ways to live our lives, just as a parent gives rules to their kids as a way to protect them. We can read about God in the Bible and know that he is far from any human definition of jealousy. His jealousy is linked to his holiness. The Gospel Coalition says it in this way: when he encounters that which is a contradiction of his holiness, he reacts in wrath, and he is jealous that what is right and good be pursued instead. God's jealousy is not indicative of weakness or a character flaw on his part, but it is part of his holy omnipotence. Knowing that God can have perfect jealousy should be reassuring to us in this way. It reminds us that we follow the one and only holy God, the only one who can truly deal with right or wrong, the only one who could help Israel in their many times of need. If we think about the immense power of his jealousy, we can be reassured that he has the same power to love us, which I'm sure many of you have seen time and time again. The overarching narrative in the Bible is one of love, and it is my belief that God's jealousy fits perfectly within that narrative. Thank you.